So not knowing quite what to do, we attended a community meeting to support our neighbors and to make sure that everyone knew that the building, in fact, might be older than anyone else suspected. Because an architect on our board, Rick Detweiler, who's here with us tonight, had been in the building about 40 years earlier and had seen that it contained heavy 18th century brace framing, some of which you see here in this photo that was taken more recently after some of the plaster was removed from the walls. A map from the time, roughly around the time Shirley built the house, shows the Shirley estate and some of the outbuildings that would have been typical on a gentleman's country estate in the 1700s, which is what this was. You can see various structures would be used for housing animals, draft animals, sheep and goats, maybe a hen house, a dairy, a laundry, perhaps an ice house, a barn for salt hay, all typical of a gentleman's country estate. And since that first glimpse that Rick had 40 years ago of this building that he thought might be an outbuilding, we had also come to know that Governor Shirley and his descendants had owned at least a couple of captive servants of African descent. And knowing that there was a precedent for housing enslaved people in separate buildings at the Royal House and Slave Quarters in Medford, we wondered if it was possible that 4244 Shirley might once have served as a slave quarters. And if so, we wondered further whether the building or the land around it might contain any traces of the history of those enslaved people. Given the legacy of the British Empire in America, its domination in the slave trade in the 18th century, and it was the biggest slave trader in the world at this time, and the long shadow that the British Empire's social structure cast upon American civic life, it really became our duty to stop the project, at least so that some research could be carried out before the building was torn down. It would be really unconscionable to let any possible traces of the history of the people that could have been there be erased. So, not ever having saved a historic house from demolition before, we reached out to the Boston Landmarks Commission to see if they could help. And their response was apply for city landmark status and include all the parcels you currently own, plus the one that the threatened property sits on. So you can do that in Boston if a property is threatened, but you don't own it, you can still get it landmarked. That's done for the community good. This process would delay the permitting for demolition and then kick off further architectural research to explore the building's history. So we submitted a petition, got that going, and with that process underway, we set out to get a better picture of the story of the people that had been enslaved at Shirley Place. And we eventually connected with Abid Ali Bai, who you see in the upper right here, has a PhD candidate at Harvard University, who was at that moment, and actually still is, doing his research on the enslaved people of the Medford's royal family. He was limited in his research by the closure of many institutions. We hired him just as the pandemic began. But despite the limitations of having sort of so many institutions closed to him, he was able to do a lot online. And by June of 2021, Abid had prepared for us a working report on enslavement at Shirley Place that actually yielded far more information than we had dreamed would turn up. And if it didn't confirm that the building we were trying to save was definitively a slave quarters, it did reveal that enslaved people were well represented in the hierarchy of Governor Shirley's household and that of his daughter's family, who you recall owned the house after the governor died. And in fact, his daughter and her husband were far wealthier than Shirley ever was. So they could have owned even more captive humans. I wanted to share with you the web link for the study report that BLC prepared, which also contains Abid's draft report. So as part of their process, the Landmarks Commission brought in a team of building historians to examine the interior and the exterior of the building. And what they found was intriguing. They confirmed that the heavy framing of the building was typical of something along the lines of a barn. They found 18th century plaster and lath in the ceiling of the first floor, something that you don't usually find in a barn unless it was also occupied by humans. And combined with what Abid had revealed about the enslaved population at Shirley Place, that was enough evidence to convince the Boston Landmarks Commission to preserve the building and the land it sits on. And in fact, in record-breaking time of a year from the time we introduced the petition to the time it was signed by the mayor, the site was inaugurated as the first Boston City landmark to be tied to the history of enslavement. So the building was saved, and as the developer retooled his plans, he was kind enough to let our team of architectural historians, Bill Finch and Rick Detwiller, into the building to further investigate. And what they discovered, because you sometimes have to look at a building several times before you can really fully understand it, they discovered that the building was originally twice as large as it is now, and that its framing was identical to that in the Shirley Mansion itself. And in this rendering by Bill Finch, you can see the numbering on the rafters. You can see it sort of at the bottom of this diagram. And the rafters themselves literally had numbers painted on them. That's how they put buildings together in those days. It was like a sort of a puzzle. The pink section is the portion of the building that as exists today. And the gray section indicates the part that's missing, where rafters 1 through 6 would have been. So a much longer building. Other research from Rachel Hoyle actually revealed that, as you might predict for a gentleman who was also the royal governor, William Shirley had a fine collection of horses, some for riding, some for pulling his coach. These horses were so valuable that Shirley even went to the expense of sending them to England to be trained. Shirley's stable was nearly as grand as his house and an integral part of the architectural experience of the estate. Here's an example of this, of a sort of what Shirley was looking at. This is the stable at Belton in Lincolnshire in the UK. This is an example of the English precedents that not only Shirley, but other New England elites were looking at. The stable itself is pictured on the left here, and you can see how it echoes the style and scale of Belton House. It was an integral piece of the architectural experience of these grand estates, usually situated near the house, and sometimes even comprising a wing of the house itself. The size and scale of these structures were a reminder that not only did the estate's owner have a big house, as you can see, but he also had at least one coach and a quantity of fine horses for riding and some for drawing the coach, all themselves deserving of a fine building, as well as a staff to maintain them. So you're thinking, okay, a nice big garage with a lot of living space above it. Lots of people have that. The implication being that the coaches would have been kept in the ground floor and the people would have lived above. But in fact, in Imperial Britain, the governor's coach was an integral part of the presentation of authority in the colony. What you see in this slide is one of the Queen of England's royal coaches dating back to the 1700s, taking the Queen to Parliament in a throwback to the pageantry of 18th century royal governance. You can see the royal coat of arms on the doors of the coach and on the drape of the seat. The attendants all dressed in livery, and the extensive gilding and gold braiding to really sort of dazzle the eye on a sunny Boston day in the 1700s. Governor Shirley and Massachusetts' other royal governors would have traveled similarly. His coach bearing perhaps his or maybe even the king's coat of arms on its door. They had to replicate royal protocol and royal precedent in the colony in order to sort of continually assert that presence and authority. The coachman in front drove, the footman in back rode along, and sometimes ran ahead to clear the street and let people know that the governor approached, sometimes literally shoving people out of the way. If you were a commoner or out on the street when the governor's coach rode by, you were expected to remove your hat and bow or curtsy. These signs were the birthright of respect, were the birthright of the rich and powerful of the British Empire. And in fact, as we talk about at Shirley Place, even persisted for a few years after the Revolutionary War. So these guys that you see who are outside the coach are the men who would have lived in the stable, along with the various stable boys and grooms who would have cleaned the stalls and cleaned the coaches and fed and exercised the horses. In a really, really wealthy household, there could have been up to 10 to 14 people living in the stable. But in smaller households like Governor Shirley's, the roles were probably combined, because despite his pretensions, Governor Shirley was never as wealthy as he aspired to appear. Footmen in particular were often jacks of all trades. If they weren't accompanying the governor or his family, one of them might be expected to simply wait at the entry to the mansion, to open the door to guests and be ready for any call to service, whether that's running an errand or fetching the coach from the barn or whatever, from the stable. I should note too at this point that it's very likely, as was common, that the governor had some non-enslaved servants in his household, as was common in both England and New England. And we, as of yet, don't know their names either. Incidentally, coaches were not the only popular mode of transport these men would be needed for. It's little thought of today, but litters or sedan chairs were not uncommon in Boston, as well as horse-drawn sleighs in the wintertime. The sedan chairs were considered especially fitting for women and the elderly, but you did see other people taking them. And you can see in this image that this woman's retinue includes 2 black footmen, probably enslaved, who do the actual carrying, while her other fellow runs ahead to move people out of the way. So now we know a little bit about the building and its function in general terms. Let's meet the men who might have lived and worked there. The first of the enslaved men we know was owned by Governor Shirley was Jack, a mulatto boy about 19 years old, who first appears in a runaway notice published in the Boston newsletter in 1732. This is not long after William Shirley, the up-and-coming attorney from London, arrived in Boston with his wife and 8 children, sort of seeking to make his way in the world. So at this point, he's just known as Mr. Shirley, Esquire. Jack was owned previously by Joshua Winslow of Boston, and prior to that, probably by either Elisha or Hezekiah Levitt of Hingham. We're still working on who that was, or which of the two owned him. They were both wealthy farmers. He's described as having his head close shaved with 3 or 4 little scars under the corner of one of his eyes, which suggests that maybe he'd seen some hard usage, or perhaps that he was directly from West Africa, where facial scars were used often as group identifiers in communities. Jack joined Shirley's household 9 years before Shirley becomes governor, and 14 years before he started construction on the Grand Mansion in Roxbury. And I just want everybody to take a deep breath before we look at the next slide, because it's a little bit troubling. Having had 2 owners prior to Mr. Shirley, Jack may have been, for some reason, unhappy with captivity. And having lived in both town and country, Boston and Hingham, that tells us that Jack may have been more of a laborer than a craftsman, what would have been called then a man of all work. That means he would have been given the more unpleasant tasks of hauling or chopping wood, cleaning barns, mending roads, or any type of field work that didn't really require much skill. Not surprisingly, most frequent escapees from enslavement were young men of Jack's age. And in his case, living in a port city, he had more opportunities to sneak away and join a ship's crew to get out of bondage. And if a young man like Jack could escape successfully and get on board a ship, and then survive the dangerous life at sea, and then go on to learn the more skilled aspects of being a mariner, he actually would have been considered a valuable asset in the merchant fleet, as well as the Navy. And he would have met other young Black men like himself here and there. And these men were actually sometimes protected and rescued from re-enslavement by the British Navy when sort of that happened, because, or if they made a plea, because that's how valuable they were as skilled mariners. However, if he remained an ordinary seaman, an unskilled seaman, his station in life would have remained little better than his formerly enslaved status. Most ordinary sailors, white, black, or brown, were so little valued that it was rare for a ship captain to even bother to try to save them if they fell overboard. They just weren't worth it. Escape was extremely difficult, however, even in a port city. So enslaved people who were repeat offenders were sometimes subjected to degrading and painful physical restraints. And the devices that you see in this illustration meant to prevent an escape and to prevent food and drink pilfering could actually be seen occasionally on the streets of Boston and many Atlantic ports in the 18th century where African enslavement took place. And of course, don't forget that everyone who passed from Boston into Roxbury passed by the town gallows. So the reminders of extreme punishment were everywhere. And I can talk about these a little bit. So the hooked device on this fellow's neck was meant to prevent running away by catching on things. It was very inconvenient. The manacles here are simply that. They're just manacles meant to hold your wrists. These devices here at the bottom with the spears on them were leg irons that made it difficult to run or walk. And then the mouthpiece was sort of prescribed as a device for enslaved people who would drink too much. And this would prevent them from doing that. Next, we meet Thomas Scipio, the man about whom we know the most, but in some ways the least, because he may actually be two men. Thomas Scipio appears first in another runaway slave advertisement in the New England Weekly in 1736, having run away from the widow Margaret Steele, who was a member of King's Chapel, where the Shirleys and the Hutchinsons also attended. Mrs. Steele notes that Thomas was born in the colony around 1700 and speaks English very well. Her assertion that he was used to the sea suggests that he might have come from some other port city to her. We believe this is the same Thomas Scipio who later becomes a servant to Governor Shirley, for he also is listed in the muster roll of the HMS Mermaid, accompanying the by now Governor Shirley to London in 1754. However, instead of traveling as Shirley's servant in the London trip, he signs on as a crew member, thus saving Shirley the cost of his transport and enabling Thomas to earn a little bit of money as an able seaman, which he may or may not have been allowed to keep. This also suggests that by this time, Thomas has become a manservant to Governor Shirley, a position that comes with a certain amount of trust and intimacy, if even less freedom. As his personal servant, Scipio would very likely have assisted dressing and shaving the governor, in addition to keeping his wig dressed and serving his meals to him. It was common for personal servants to sleep on the floor at the foot of their master or mistress's bed, so as to be available at a moment's notice. So Thomas would have spent most of his time in the house rather than the stable, but under the sort of continual eye of the governor. So if Mrs. Steele's dating of Scipio's birth to 1700 is correct, Thomas Scipio is 54 and Shirley is 60 when they go to London together. From what we can tell, it appears that Scipio remains with the Shirley household for several more years, even after Shirley's death in 1771. We know this because he's listed in a 1775 inventory of Eliakim Hutchinson's estate. Eliakim died in 1775. And he's later referred to in a letter by his widow, Elizabeth, written in England in 1784, where she's still trying to recover the losses they incurred during the Revolutionary War. In that letter, it's the lower one below, in sort of slightly beige color, she notes that Thomas Scipio can verify her claims because he is at that point living with John Powell in Ludlow near the Welsh border. So during the siege of Boston, she and Eliakim had fled from Roxbury to Boston proper, along with many other loyalists who had country houses, in order to avoid being attacked in their home by patriots. During that spring, they left Thomas Scipio in charge of Shirley Place, despite the fact that by this time he would have been about 75 years old. The valuation of Thomas at 25 pounds, where you can see in the thing above, and this is from that 1775 inventory. So this is a 75-year-old man who's valued at 25 pounds, so 75-year-old enslaved man. That curiosity has caused our researcher Abid Alibai to wonder whether this perhaps might have been a son also named Thomas Scipio. It was common as it is today to name children after their fathers and mothers. It's unusual to value an enslaved man at that age at such a high price. And then by the time he shows up in her memorial of 1784, he would be 84 years old. Ordinarily, slave masters would have sold an aged slave before traveling abroad. So if this was indeed the same man, the only reasons we can think of for them to have gone to the expense of bringing Thomas to England with them was if he had a special skill like tailoring or as a chef, or perhaps as a musician. Enslaved Africans were often taught to play instruments sort of for the pleasure of their owners. Otherwise, we would probably have to conclude that this is the son, Thomas Scipio, a younger man who'd be more valuable. So we lose track of Thomas Scipio after his return to England. If he lived, he was probably there until at least 1794 when his new owner, Mr. Powell, died. But we really have more research to do there. We've been in touch with scholars in England, and so far they haven't been able to find any burial or death records for him. If it was the same man and he had been kept on because of his tremendous skill at something or other, we can't assume he died surrounded by loving and grateful masters. Usually when enslaved men and women got too old to work, their masters would finally free them so they could be turned over to the local almshouse, which would then have to bear the expense of feeding and caring for them until they died and were buried in a pauper's grave. Another interesting mystery regarding Thomas Scipio is that we can't find baptismal records for him or the younger Thomas, if there was one. This was unusual for a slave owned by an Anglican. While sort of some Puritans or Congregationalists resisted baptizing their captives for fear of the power it could give them, Anglican ministers were really enthusiastic about saving Black souls because they really believed that it would inspire obedience to their masters. But in 18th century Boston, we also know that some owners provided a small amount of leeway to their adult captives in terms of religious commitment. And so many enslaved people, if they even chose to be Christian, joined informal congregations centered around a Black preacher who might themselves have been enslaved. And so you can imagine that these informal congregations meeting in kitchens or barns left virtually no records, but they testify to the little bits of choice and agency that an enslaved man or woman could muster by worshiping as they chose. Kiera Singleton at the Royal House and Slave Quarters has pointed out that sometimes these people would actually escape for a few hours to participate in these services and, would go back home sort of hopefully unnoticed or willing to put up with whatever punishments were given for that. And maybe this was Thomas's preference. We have more to find out. There is also a man named Caesar who is bequeathed to Eliakim by his mother in 1765 when he and his wife are just beginning to take ownership of Shirley Hall. Caesar, his apparel, and his bedding, you can see in the outline here, are together valued at 26 pounds at this point, which translate to about $1,200 today, rather less than Thomas Scipio. For the moment, this is all we have on Caesar. No church records mention him either, so we're going to have to dig a little bit deeper. As a male captive worth less than the manservant Thomas Scipio, Caesar might have been one of the ones who spent time in the stable that Shirley built, especially since it was Thomas Scipio and not Caesar who was entrusted with caring for the estate when Eliakim and Elizabeth fled for Boston in 1775. Of course, on the other hand, you could look at it the other way and say that, the elderly Thomas, they'll sacrifice him to the rebels, right? But Caesar's still young and strong and too valuable to leave behind. Two Negro children are also listed in Eliakim's 1775 probate inventory. We believe they are the Caesar and Affy who King's Chapel records tell us were baptized in 1773 as servants of Eliakim Hutchinson. These two children, you can see it says Negro woman and two children. They may have been the children of the Negro woman listed with them, or they may have simply been lumped with her according to their lesser monetary value. It's hard to say. Their ages aren't listed other than being listed as child. And given the frequency of separation of parents and children, we don't know for the moment. So one of the children was named Caesar, who again may be the child of the Negro woman or may not. If he is, maybe he's the son of the Caesar we discussed earlier, who was in Eliakim Hutchinson's mom's will. For boys, in the rare case a child was taught to read and write, and there was actually great debate among both Anglicans and Puritans about this as to whether it was a good thing to do or not. The chances were more likely that girls were taught to read and write than boys. Enslaved male children were more valuable as small laborers, and that's probably where young Caesar fit into the hierarchy of the household. This would have really limited his opportunity to learn about books. His master Eliakim was a merchant. So in the city, Caesar would have been put to work wheeling trade goods to and from Eliakim's shops and warehouses and ships. He would have also been put to the task of cleaning chimneys. He would have been told to fetch Mr. Hutchinson's horse from the nearby livery because commercial livery stables were more common than to have an actual stable in your house in the city. It was just easier to do, to board your house at a commercial livery stable. It was also typical to have boys chop wood every morning and bring it inside for the household fires. And he would have been asked to run any number of errands daily, especially as a messenger, because that's how you communicated in an age with no telephones. In the city, Caesar would probably have slept at night in the kitchen with the other enslaved servants where it was warm. In the country house in Roxbury, where Shirley Place is, a good portion of Caesar's work would likely have centered around the stable. He might assist in cleaning the stalls, grooming the horses, cleaning mud from the coach and its tackle, and being sure to put fresh straw in the coach when the family went out in cold weather. You put straw in the bottom of the coach to keep the family's feet warm. He might also be expected to fetch water, feed the chickens and the pigs, and again, clean chimneys. Small boys were almost invariably given that task because they were small and could fit, much to the detriment of their health and safety. When in the country with the family, Caesar very likely slept in the stable itself with the coachman and other men and boys who worked outside the house. Like the other men in the household, we don't know what became of Caesar after the Hutchinsons fled Boston, but we know what the expectations for him would have been in a household as wealthy as theirs. As he got older, he might have become a part of their retinue as a footman or maybe even a coachman if he got some skills. Prior to the Revolution, men and boys employed in this capacity in America wore brightly colored livery with lots of gold braid and trim, just like they did in England. Like the coach itself, the livery was meant to convey immediately which household they were connected with. So every household's livery was different. To have Black coachmen and footmen was fashionable in some circles. And to make them seem even more exotic, their costumes were sometimes given sort of an Arabic flair, as you see here on the man Christian van Meelhoop, who wears a turban and a short sleeve jacket. By the way, it's really rare for us to have the actual name of an enslaved man. That makes this portrait really an important piece. On the one hand, these sort of costume flourishes were pure fancy, but on the other, this infusion of the exotic into the pageantry was a conscious nod to the reach of the British Empire in these years. In this particular portrait, the man and the owner are Dutch, also an empire trading nation at the time, but the message is the same. So we started out with the males in the household because they would have been most closely associated with the workings of the stable, the building that we wanted to save. But now we can move across the street and talk about the realm of the house itself. So in 1746, in the same year he was embarking on the construction of his country estate in Roxbury, Governor Shirley baptized an infant girl named Jane at King's Chapel. And so We believe that Jane eventually becomes the Negro woman listed with the 2 children that you see in the inventory. There is no record elsewhere in the chapel records of a burial of Jane, so we might be able to guess that she's that woman listed in the inventory. She'd be 27 by this time, by the time of the inventory. Perhaps Jane was lucky enough to have been able to keep any children that she had with her, and maybe one of them was that boy, Caesar. And perhaps he's named after the Caesar we met earlier. But we can't be sure, especially in this case, because these children weren't baptized until they were children, which suggests that they didn't arrive in the Shirley household until then. Ordinarily, the Shirleys baptized all their infant enslaved children while they were still infants. So this is a bit of a mystery. We have no other records about Jane, so for the moment, she's as mysterious as the elder Caesar. What we do know is that as an 18th century enslaved woman, her work would primarily have been in the domestic sphere. She could have worked in the estate's kitchens, assisting with cooking and cleaning up. The 2 jobs were actually usually separate, cook being of a higher status than scullery maid. Scullery maid was the one who was sort of responsible for all the dishes and silverware, cleaning them and making sure they didn't get broken and putting them away. She could have also worked as a laundress for the household. That was a full-time job in and of itself, or a general housemaid whose tasks included lighting the fires in the house, heating water for bathing, and carrying it upstairs to the bedrooms. Housemaids also cleaned chamber pots, changed bed linens, drew the curtains, and scrubbed the floors. She also may have helped to tend the estate's kitchen garden if her duties were centered around the kitchen. Despite the relative comfort of her indoor life outside of the elements, she was not exactly safe. Enslaved and indentured women were more often than not, that is, more than 50% of the time, subjected to sexual predation by the men who lived in the household and even those who only came and went. Mulatto children, those born of a white and a black parent, were produced from the earliest days of slavery in Massachusetts and were only very rarely, sometimes, but rarely, the product of the union of a black man and a white woman. White fathers often sold their mulatto children soon after birth in order to keep the woman focused on her work. And while in other households they might be kept on, under colony law, they followed the status of their mother. That is, they were born into slavery. And when punishments were meted out for producing a child out of wedlock or for adultery, the enslaved woman bore the brunt of it. Masters were sometimes asked to pay a fine, but the girl could be put in the pillory or whipped for her sins. Every effort was made in the courts, and the court records are just ample with examples of this. Every effort was made to protect the reputation of the man than to serve justice for the woman. Let's see here. My slide is not advancing. There we go. The other child listed with the anonymous Negro woman and the 2 children in the 1775 inventory might be Affy. She was baptized along with the boy Caesar in 1773, and so maybe Jane's daughter and Caesar's sister. As Anglicans, the expectation was that she would live a godly life under the guidance of her owners and her godmother and sponsor, Frances Ballin Shirley, who was William Shirley's granddaughter. So they're baptizing these children, and they're also going through the trouble of actually getting a godparent for them to ensure their sort of spiritual progress. As a captive girl, however, Affy's material life would be filled with really more gritty reality than spiritual growth. From about the age of 6, she would have been trained up to a variety of domestic tasks, some of them skilled, including needlework, knitting, and cooking. These skilled crafts could add some perceived value to her as a worker. More menial tasks that she might have been expected to perform were in the housemaid realm we discussed earlier: ironing, emptying chamber pots, scrubbing floors, and perhaps helping out with the laundry, which was a task too backbreaking for little girls to perform on their own. Like Caesar and Jane, we lose track of Affy after her baptism because Eliakim and Elizabeth fled Roxbury for the British-controlled Boston in 1775. And while that chaotic time meant the loss of nearly everything for loyalists like the Hutchinsons, it sometimes gave their enslaved servants the opportunity to escape. And in fact, many former slaves made a beeline for Nova Scotia in these years when the opportunity arose. And, you know, we can hope that that's what became of Affie, Nanny, and Jane, or Affie and Caesar and Jane. So lastly, there's Nanny, a toddler girl belonging to 24-year-old Catherine Maria Shirley, who was buried in August 1753, just a few days after her baptism at the age of 8 months. So it was a common and really unfortunate practice among British subjects in the 18th century to remove infants from their mothers and give them as gifts to others, primarily to white women. As one contemporary put it, they were given away like puppies. Such may have been the case with Nanny, whose mother is not known. And it's hard to imagine the circumstances of her death under Catherine's care, and I guess I mean emotionally hard. You know, was she a plaything given to her by her fiance, John Irving? Was she a practice child for Catherine's own upcoming duties as a mother? It's hard enough to acknowledge the separation of parents and children under the grim circumstances of just death or war or acts of God. But to me, it's truly mind-boggling to think of the casual indifference and cruelty in a separation that is meant simply to satisfy a whim of fashion. But this is what the social structure did to the consciences of the elites. If Nanny had lived and grew to be an attractive and docile child, she might be elevated to the position of a lady's maid. And perhaps that was the fate that Catherine hoped to bestow on that little infant. In that case, Nanny might have had nicer clothing than the other enslaved girls in the household, and she might be given better food than her fellow servants. Running errands for her mistress might give her some precious moments of freedom, but she was then also more subject to the whims of a capricious owner. She, like Thomas, would have been expected to sleep nearby in her mistress's bedroom on a pallet on the floor, and to be on call for any demand that might come in the middle of the night. Depending on the occasion, though, she might be dressed up as an adornment to her mistress, as this little girl in the portrait of the Duchess of Portsmouth is dressed in a little pearl necklace and a silk gown. But most of the time, she would have been wearing used or low-grade versions of her owner's clothing. And you can see, as in this portrait, there were undoubtedly moments and maybe even entire lives. There are even documented entire lives of affection and tenderness between enslaver and enslaved. But it was, of course, always predicated on utter subservience. Once in a great while, a girl in this favored position sometimes had the luck to be taught reading and writing, as did the young poet Phillis Wheatley. And had she lived, Nanny would be the same age as Phillis. And had she grown to be a teenager, she might once or twice have glimpsed the remarkable Phillis on the street, since the Congregational South Meeting House was just a few doors down from the King's Chapel, where Nanny would have gone to church. But as valuable as reading and writing were for a young Black woman and her chances, in the end, it still wasn't enough to save even Phillis, who died free but penniless and alone in 1784, a Black woman in 18th century Boston. So there's a little bit of insight into the enslaved people we know about at Shirley Place. There's a lot more research to be done, more archaeology, more repositories in England and the US to be explored, and more to learn about how the buildings at Shirley Place give depth and nuance to the lives of the people that live there. And so if you'll bear with me for a couple minutes, I'll give you a couple updates on that building. Last fall, the Boston City archaeologist Joe Bagley and his team surveyed the site's front yard. And among other really interesting findings was a cowrie shell that you see in the hand of the person in the Instagram post on your right. Cowries come from Africa and were used for trade and communications for centuries there. And in fact, they have their own whole interesting history, kind of like wampum in the Native American cultures. And interestingly, according to Joe, they are not usually found in sites in Boston that don't have a link to slavery. So though the building has yet to tell us its story directly, the dirt around it has made the link for us. We're seeking ways to buy the building so that we can create a plan to turn it into an exhibit and learning venue for commemorating the lives of Thomas Scipio and Nanny and Affie and the others, but also to help Boston and New England better understand how the British Empire played its role in how the slave trade under the British Empire cast really a very long, dark, and enduring shadow across the American experiment. The racism and social inequity we struggle to address today can really be located in that imperial enterprise that reached its peak here in the mid-1700s. Good news is that we've received $650,000 from the Community Preservation Committee in Boston and have partnered with HBI to sort of push this project. And we hope soon to begin a fundraising campaign that will help us acquire the remaining $450,000 that's needed to purchase the building. And so our ask from you is to spread the word, make a donation, and help us change the face of Boston history. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Suzy. So now we're going to open up for questions and discussion. And I know we're pushing an hour, so if people need to go, I understand that. But if you'd like to stay for some of the discussion or to ask a question, we'd love to have you.
I could add a couple of things if you're interested. Can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you, Rick.
Okay, good. I do have some nice visuals for you of servants that I've been collecting for the kitchen exhibit potentially. So there are a lot, including a very good shot of the Mount Vernon kitchen with two of the slaves sitting there. Anyway, I'll be glad to send them along to you.
Okay, sure.
Thank you, Rick.
Okay.
And as to questions, feel free to either, you can raise your hand on your video. If you know how to do it on your, little icon, feel free to do that as well. Yeah. If you have a question, or we can just jump in.
So how that the cowrie shell seems, do you think it's as important as any of the other evidence, or is it just does it just corroborate what you already knew?
Yeah, it just corroborates. So everything else is documentary and not sort of, near the site. So what's exciting about the cowrie shell is just that it's there, that it's on the site, a piece of tangible history. But right, none of it stands very strongly on its own, but when you put it all together, it all starts to build a case,
And where was it found? How deep in the ground? And
they had to go pretty deep. There's been so much work there. What do you think, Rachel? Was it 18 inches where they found the cowrie shell?
I think so. It was a little difficult because I know the first couple layers were fill, so the ground had been kind of disturbed for the 3 centuries since 2 centuries since the house had been moved. But yeah, once they got about 18 inches down, that's where they found that, as well as a few other things that I guess they're examining in the lab now.
Right. So Joe Bagley will be doing a report, which hasn't come out yet, where he sort of pulls together all of the findings of the dig. And one of the other pieces that they found, they think was sort of going even further, was what they called a kitchen pit, which they have found in some other sites. Sometimes enslaved people dug a pit inside the kitchen and would sometimes dispose of sort of ritual relics and things like that in those pits. And they found what they think might be one of those, but they felt like it was too culturally sensitive to actually proceed with a further dig there. So that's the kind of thing where they would like to get more community input before doing a further exploration there.
So we have a question from, we'll go Yvonne first and then Archer.
Hi, Yvonne.
Hi, and thank you so much. Just a question about King's Chapel. I had never considered the chapel or that church as a source of primary documents. Could you talk a little bit more about King's Chapel as a resource?
Sure. So a couple of years ago, they published the records of King's Chapel. The Colonial Society published their records. So it's available in 2 volumes, and it's a gold mine of information about Boston at the time and burials. So, all the baptismal records, all the marriage records are all in this book format. I think you can see part of it online. And if you have special, like if you're affiliated with a university or something, I think you can actually view an online version of it, but you can also just go to the library and ask to see it in a reference collection. It's full of great data.
Bill Kuttner is our resident expert on King's Chapel.
Let me just say that King's Chapel has an ongoing program. Well, they started several years ago and they're still working on it. And they have identified the names of all the enslaved people who were associated that had been, because obviously the church has, hundreds of members, some of whom have enslaved people. They built a database about this, and they are in the process now of planning some sort of a memorial. And if you go to the King's Chapel website, there's some sort of updates on that. So that is ongoing, and it's they're dealing with larger numbers, and since they're looking at the entire membership of the church. So anyway, that's yes, good question. Look into that. It's happening. Yeah.
I can add something else about the publication. The Colonial Society has a website, and all of their publications are on the website, so you can go directly to that to see the publications.
Oh, there you go. Megan Holmes just put it up on you can link to it in the chat.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Suzy, maybe you want to mention the urban ministry presentation and the people that were involved in the First Unitarian Church there.
Yeah, so you all may have read about it in the newspaper a couple of weeks ago. The same fellow who did the research for us, Abid Ali Bai, was hired not too long ago to do the same kind of research for the First Parish in Roxbury, the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry, and that was very productive. He came up with, I think, about 100 names of both free and enslaved African and Native American people in that parish, from its founding through, I can't remember when the end date was. So there's a lot more information there as well. And they may have actually already published that report, but it's another really valuable source of information that they worked on with the Roxbury Historical Society.
Okay, we'll take the question from Archer.
Suzy, I'm trying to figure out what the reference to Phyllis Wheatley was. You're not implying that Phyllis had any connection with the house, or are you? I sort of...
No, it was just poetic. It's just that Nanny, the infant who died, was born in the same year as Phyllis. And if she had lived, right, she would have gone to King's Chapel. And, she could, in our imagination, seen Phyllis, right. The poet.
Phyllis becomes a good story to keep in mind, because there's a tendency, we know so little, in fact, but there's a tendency to place speculation and assumptions about the individuals as individuals arise. And it's important to remember that, yes, there was a fairly typical experience of being an enslaved person, but there were always exceptions. And until you know what one of these people's actual lived experiences was, one has to temper your speculation about it.
Correct. Yeah, there's several possibilities. Yeah. Phyllis's experience, I think, is really interesting because so we hold her up as this wonderful example. And in fact, Catherine Maria Shirley, Nanny's owner, marries John Irving Jr. John Irving Jr.'s father was one of the men who tested Phyllis. I don't know if anybody knows the story of Phyllis Wheatley, but at some point in Boston, there's this sort of discussion about this poet and whether a Black woman can actually create poetry. This just sounds crazy. And so they pulled together this committee of men who are going to test her, and they test her knowledge of Latin and Greek and all of this kind of stuff, just to be sure, you know, that this isn't some kind of a hoax. And so it's Nanny's father-in-law who's one of the people on that committee. The whole thing, of course, is just, you know, reeks with condescension and cruelty, but there you go.
It is always interesting, however, to when telling Phyllis's story, to remember that Phyllis was the second most famous American in Europe in that period of time, second only to Benjamin Franklin. And it just shows you how the difference in the perception of African people in Europe as opposed to America goes back hundreds of years. She wasn't just a curiosity. She was generally a highly respected poet and person of literature in Europe. And it's also interesting that her very first book, which was printed in England, was part of the cargo of the tea ship and was the only item on that ship legally unloaded in Boston.
That's an interesting fact.
Very cool.
Thank you very much, Suzy. I got to run.
Thank you, Archer. Thank you so much, everybody. We would love to get your feedback. Feel free to email. Maybe Rachel, you could put our emails in the chat if anybody has follow-up questions or, you know, thoughts or comments or criticisms. We'd love to hear it.
I thought you told the story really well, and it was really painful to listen to at times.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I mean, that's the reality.
Yes, that's good. That's a good thing, Suzy. You did a great job. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Our discomfort is somebody else's true and enduring pain.
Reality, yeah.
Right.
You told the story really well.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Oh, there's a
Good night,
message
everybody.
from,
Thanks,
I think
Suzy.
Kathleen
Thanks,
Glynn has a
Rachel.
question. Rachel?
Yeah,
Thanks,
Kathleen.
guys.
No, I was actually just saying good night.
Oh, okay. Good night, everybody.
Thank you
Good
and good
night.
night.
Thank you.
We'll stay on for a couple more minutes if folks want to linger for questions. Oh, Finch, you're here. Hi. Thanks so much for attending, Barbara.
Oh, thank you so much, Suzy. Great presentation.
Oh, thanks. Good. I'm glad.
So
Oh, that's
important.
Ginny. Yeah, right. So much more work to be done.
Mm.
Hey, Ginny, thank you. Oh, Kathy came. Hi, Kathy. Thank you. And
Hey,
Sylvia.
hey.
Thank you, Sylvia, for coming, for joining us.
Great presentation. It was wonderful.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Yeah, no, good job. Tells a story that's hard to hear. You know, when you hear it and put it together, you can kind of know it from a distance or hear things, but when you hear it so concrete, it's powerful. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm glad I put you through that.
Me too, and I listened. Yay!
Oh boy, yeah. But it's also very interesting too.
It is very interesting. I would agree with that. All right.
Good night. Thanks for joining us, Kathy. No, she's not listening. Thank you, Jeff. I'm glad you made it. All right, I'm signing off.
Are you planning to present at other places, Suzy? I mean, I think the way you did the talk, it would be a great fundraiser, but also just, yeah, like at historical association meetings and stuff.
Yeah, we actually just gave it to the Brookline